Hello everyone, and welcome to this video where we will be building a URL shortener using Deno, DenoKV, and DenoKV OAuth. Let's take a look at the website we'll be building. We first have this page prompting us to sign in with GitHub. If we click on it, it'll ask us to enter our GitHub credentials. So I'll type in learn by doing. Once we're signed in, the homepage changes, asking me to enter a URL to short. We can also notice that the navbar changed and there's a link to view all my shorts and a link to sign out. So I'll enter a URL. I'll enter one from the fresh documentation and click short me. This creates a short and redirects us to the shorts page where we can see all the links associated to our account. I can see the short URL as well as view original. So if I click on it, I see the original URL that was shorted, similar to this one. So we can click on the copy icon, and in a new tab, if we enter it, it should hit our app and then redirect us to the fresh URL that it's linked to. We also have the ability to delete routes. So I can delete this one, and we see now that there's only the one from W3 schools, and I can also delete that one. It's a simple app, but it lets us have authentication with our DenoKV database, and also links specific data to the user. In this case, each short belongs to one user. To get started, in my terminal, I'll create a new project, hit enter. I'll give it a name of fresh short. And I'll select yes for Tailwind CSS and yes for Visual Studio Code. We want to use DenoKV, which is still experimental, so we have some setup to get that working. First, I'll head to the main.typescript file, and I'll add the unstable reference. Also in deno.json, I'll add the unstable flag to our start task and hit save. We're also going to be using DenoKV OAuth package, so let's include that in our imports. If we head down and see our import section, I'll add a new one for DenoKV. I'll be using the version 0.2.5. Let's also delete some of the automatically generated files. So we don't need the API route. We don't need the greet. I'll keep 404 app and index. For islands and components, we don't need these. So I'll get rid of all this. Let's also clear out most of what we have in our index route, and I'll just leave this as hello. So let's try and run our project. And we should just see hello being printed out. Cool. So we're ready to actually start coding. First thing I want to do is build the OAuth part of our app to allow users to log in and sign out and have access to restricted pages if they're logged in. I took heavy inspiration from the Deno Saskit project. So if we head over to Showcase, we can find the Deno Saskit project. If you're familiar with it, you'll probably recognize the patterns for the authentication parts. If not, I really recommend it. It's a great project and you can learn a lot from it just by reading the code. In the fresh docs, if we scroll to the bottom, we also have a section for using DenoKV OAuth. It shows us how to integrate the client, the sign in and sign out routes, the callback route, and how to use the helper functions. Our client sign in and sign out logic will be exactly the same. We'll modify the callback to also allow us to create a user entity in DenoKV to allow us to have some kind of relationship between shorts and users. So back in our editor, let's go ahead and create the client sign-in route and sign-out route, similar to the example that we just saw. So first thing I'll do is create a folder called utils, which will have our OAuth client. So I'll copy that. And I'll import the same logic that we saw in the example. So we'll import the GitHub client from KV OAuth, and we'll create a new instance of it that we'll export and be able to use throughout our app. Then I'll create the sign-in route inside of our routes folder. We'll import the handlers from Fresh since we need to handle GET requests. We'll import the sign-in function from KV OAuth. We'll also import our GitHub client that we just created. And then we'll create the handler and we'll simply call the sign-in function, passing it the request and client. Next, we'll create the sign-out route. The sign-out route will be essentially the same as the sign-in. We'll import the handlers. We'll import the sign-out function from KV OAuth. Then we'll create our get handler and call the sign-out function, passing it the request. Last step is the callback route. Let's create a new route under routes called callback.ts. This is what GitHub will call after a user enters the credentials to sign in. It'll contain the session information, the response, and access token, all of which we'll need. First, we'll import the handlers. Then we'll import the handle callback function from KV OAuth. And finally, the GitHub client as well. If we look at the example from the fresh documentation, all it does is call the handle callback function and gets the response and returns it. And whenever it wants to check if a user is logged in this example, we can see that we get the session ID from the request object. And then if there is a session ID, meaning the user was logged in, we then get the access token using another helper function from the KV OAuth package. With the access token, we make an API call to GitHub to get the user information, and then we return that user information. We want to do essentially the same thing, but we want to do it inside of the callback route. Whenever someone signs in, we want to call GitHub to get the user information based off of the access token. And then we want to save that user information in our database so that we don't always have to call GitHub to get the user login information, the username and all that, to be able to associate it with any other data that we want to have a relationship with the user. Similar to the example, we'll create an interface called user, which will contain the fields that GitHub will return to us. This will have the login information. So for my case, it would be something like learn by doing 993. It'll have the name and the avatar URL. We'll then create our handler. We'll call the handle callback function, passing it the request and the OAuth client. We don't need to use the helper functions in this case, like in the example, because the handle callback function already gives us the access token and the session ID. With that access token, we'll call the GitHub API to be able to fetch the user information associated to that access token. We'll parse that JSON to our user object. Next steps are essentially storing that user object in DenoKV. We haven't created the functions for it yet, so I'll just write some comments for each step that we need to take, and then we'll fill them in as we build the database functions related to it. We'll first want to get the current user. So we want to check if the user already exists in our database. One thing you might have noticed in the fresh example is that the only information that tells us a user is logged in is if there's a session ID. Because the first step to getting the user information is calling getSessionID off of the request. Session ID changes every time the user logs in. So if I log out and log in again, session ID will be different, or it'll be renewed after it expires. So we can't just use the session ID to represent a user because it's not always the same value. The user login information, on the other hand, is always going to be the same thing because that's what we get from GitHub API. So we can use both of those together. We can use the session ID to find the user login information. But we don't want to make an API call every time we want that information, so we'll store the user login in the database with the session ID. We'll also have a key that will give us the user login based off of the session ID. The only gotcha is that whenever a new session ID is generated for an existing user, we need to delete the previous key that linked the old session ID to the user login. And we need to create a new one. So back in our code, if the user exists, we'll want to call a function to delete that user session mapping that we have between the session ID and the user entity object itself. And then we want to update the current user to make sure it has the new session ID. Otherwise, we would just create a brand new user with that session ID that we got. Okay, so that's all we would need to complete our OAuth logic. So let's go ahead and create the database functions related to this user management. So inside of my project, I'll just create a new folder. Actually, I'll create it inside of utils. I'll create a new file called db.ts. I'll create a new KV instance by calling deno.openKV. I'll create a user entity interface, which will represent our users in the database. It'll have the login. So like we mentioned, this would be the same login that we get from GitHub. And it'll also have the session ID, which will be updated based off of whenever a user logs in again, signs out, logs in. First function that we'll create is the ability to create a brand new user and also updating it. So I'll create an async function called create or update user that takes in a user entity object. We'll create the user key, which is users, and the login, which is supposed to be unique. We'll also create another key, which is for finding users by the session ID. The key elements will be users by session ID and the session ID itself. We can now create an atomic operation and set the user for the user's key and the users by session ID key, and then we can hit commit. Now for that response that we get back, if everything is okay, we would just stop there. If there's any issue, we'll throw an error saying that we failed to create or update a user. Next is going to be deleting a session ID to a user mapping, which means deleting this key value that we would have just created. So we'll create a new function called delete users by session. It'll take in the session ID, and all we do is call our KV instance called delete on users by session and pass in it the session ID. I'll create another function to retrieve users by session. So we'll call this get user by session. It'll take in a session ID and it'll return either a user entity or a null if nothing was found. And so we'll create our key, users by session key, which maps to our users by session. And then we call our KV instance, passing it that key, and return the response value, which is user entity or null. I'll do the exact same thing, but for getting a user based off of the login information, since that's what we store under the user's key element. And yep, that's all the functions that we'll need to handle users in our app. So we can now head back to our callback route, and now we can fill in all these comments with the actual functions related to it. So to get a user, we'll call the getUser function and make sure to import that. And now based off of if we have a user or not, we can delete the user by session ID and update the existing user. So we're using delete user by session, passing it the old session ID that was associated to that user that we retrieved. And then we'll call creator update user, passing it the current user information and just making sure to update the session ID that's being stored to the one that we got up here when calling handle callback. In the case that this is a brand new user that's logging in to our app, we'll create a user entity object using the GitHub user login information and the session ID that we got from the handle callback, and then we'll call creator update user on that object. Last thing that we need is to return the response, which also we got from handle callback. Our OAuth logic is completely done. We now have the ability to sign in users, sign them out, and on sign in, we link the session ID to the GitHub user information and have a way to retrieve it without making more API calls. Before working on our index route and creating the UI to test the login and logout functionalities, we should create the base middleware, which will check if a user is signed in or not and give us a simple way to propagate that information so we don't always have to use the helper functions in every route. I will create under our route folder a _middleware TypeScript file. I'll import the middleware handler context, get session ID from KV OAuth, and the user entity interface and get user by session function from our database logic that we just created. I'll create an interface to represent the state of our application, which contains the session ID or undefined if the user is not logged in, and similar, the user entity object or undefined if no one's logged in. We can then create our middleware handler. First, I'll get the session ID. I'll assign that to our context state. If there's a session ID, I'll try to get the user based on it from our database. If there's something, I'll assign our context to it. And finally, I'll return the context.next. And with this, we can easily have access to the session ID or lack of session ID in our routes. We've done most of the backend for our OAuth logic. In the next video, we'll create all the UI that makes use of it so that we can confirm that everything is working as expected. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!